Hey guys, well today we're going to continue in Amos and we'll be in Amos 5 and starting in verse 18 and then maybe we'll go through the end of the chapter, maybe just to verse 24. But it's really going to encapsulate all of the things that we talked about yesterday with the themes of Amos. The idea of being comfortable and assuming that because we're comfortable, because we're living comfortably, that God approves of everything we're doing, the ignoring the law of God, ignoring the warnings of God, really ignoring the call to obey God, and instead kind of going, hey, what's the big deal? This passage also really encapsulates this idea of God, I am totally fine with you punishing the rest of the world. Like, go get those other nations, and then just in shock as we go, but God, why would you punish us? And this is really an eye-opening passage because the truth is Israel's living exactly like all those other nations. They've adopted pagan worship and they want to claim the name of God and yet worship all the same things that the world around them is worshiping. And man, it's almost like this is more complicated in our world than it was in theirs because their gods had names and statues, like the things that the culture worshiped were gods named Baal and Asheroth and Molech and we just don't have those kind of named false gods. Instead, their attitudes, their ideologies, their materialism and secularism and whatever else might be. And I don't want to preach that sermon right now, but we too can be people who claim the name of God and yet just live like everybody else. And this is a passage that we'd have to think really deeply about, knowing that, man, that is an easy pit to fall in. That's not like some people somewhere. Needs to be on each of our minds as we are a community that seeks to honor God, that we would actually be honoring God, not just with our lips and then going out and living like everybody else. Romans 1 ends like this. Though they know God's righteous decree and those that practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. It's not just enough to know that it's bad to be the oppressor or that it's bad to, give yourself to sensuality or lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. It's not enough to just know those things and preach those things. We have to live differently than the rest of the world. And so this message to Amos, by Amos to Israel, man, we just need to listen. And I'm not going to do too much preaching. I'm just going to read. And I just want us to listen. If you wrestle with it, don't wrestle with me. Let's try to wrestle with God, wrestle with these words, and don't just say, well, this is something that people in yesteryear dealt with, but it's not for the modern church. No, come on, church. This is something that we're vulnerable to as well. It says this, woe to you who desire the day of the Lord. And the day of the Lord was the coming judgment. Why would you have the day of the Lord? These people in Israel were saying, God, we want the day of the Lord because we see this being the destruction of these enemies, these pagan nations. And Amos is saying, this is what God says. Like, have you thought this through? You really want God to judge sin? You really want God to judge evil? Man, I know you're really good at pointing out the evil every place else, but why do you want this? Have you seen your own heart? You want God to fairly judge the world? Really? Have you seen the way you live, your culture, your actions? Come on, Israel. Woe to you who desires the day of the Lord. Why would you have the day of the Lord? It is darkness and not light. You think this is going to end up in your glory. You think this is going to be a day of light for you. God's the only one glorified here. This is going to be a day of darkness for you. You're going to realize that you have not been living as the people of God. You're going to realize that you've had the name of God without obeying God. And the day of the Lord means judgment for you, just like it means judgment for them. Not because God is unfair, but because God is fair. Because it's not just being born in Israel that makes you God's people, but rather it's those that love, obey, and honor God. Verse 19, as if a man fled from a lion. This is Amos in his satirical, he's a funny guy. These images are there's a dark humor to him. It says, as if a man fled from a lion and a bear met him, or went into his house and leaned his hand against the wall and a serpent bit him. He said, look, you guys think that you look around these other nations and you say, God, go get him. And it's you saying that is like somebody who's running away from a lion and runs straight into a bear. Like, how is this better? It's like going in and coming home and feeling comfortable at the end of a day and putting your hand against your wall in your house and being bit by a snake. Like, you think you're safe, but look at the way you're living. You're not safe from the day of the Lord. And then some of the harshest words in all the scriptures in verse 21. I despise your feasts, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the peace offerings of your fattened animals, I will not look upon them. We talked about this in the introduction to the Minor Prophets, but it was God's idea to start this sacrificial system. This is supposed to be what they're supposed to do. And I think it's really interesting that the people haven't stopped being religious. They've just stopped obeying God. They've stopped living like people who honor God, but they haven't stopped being religious. They're still sacrificing. They're still keeping the feast. They're still gathering in their solemn assemblies. Like, they're still living out the traditions and rituals of the people who follow Yahweh. They just don't have a heart for God. And I've said this before, and I'll say this again, but people who have the name of God, who use the name of God and who claim the name of God and yet do not have a heart for God are the most dangerous people on the planet. That is, you can do more damage speaking in the name of God and participating in the rituals of God without a heart for God. It's the most dangerous thing for you and for the people around you. So for God to say, man, I despise your feasts, I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. He's looking down at them, having a Passover meal. You could picture this for maybe an Easter celebration. And God might look down and go, man, everybody cares about what they're wearing. Everybody cares about, was the music perfect? Everybody cares about were the decorations in church just right? Everybody cares that it looks great, but nobody's actually worshiping me. They're worshiping themselves. They're worshiping each other. I'm not saying that if we dress up and decorate the church right, that's a bad thing. That's a good thing. But it's a bad thing if our hearts aren't with God. If our hearts do not match our actions. If we have the facade of religion, but not the heart bent on honoring and loving God. Man, God says, not just, oh, I don't recognize that, but he says, I hate that. I despise it. He looks at his people and we've talked about in Hosea, we talk about how much God just loves these people. And so he's not like ready to get rid of them. He's just saying, I want you to know how bad this hurts. Like, I hate seeing this happen. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. You think this is going to work? Like, you think you can bribe God? You think you can live oppressing people and not having a heart for God at all, and you can follow these pagan practices, live exactly like everybody else in the world, and then every once in a while show up and sacrifice, and God's going to go, all right. It's the only time you ever think about me. You treat people terribly. You're participating in all these, the pagan culture, just like everybody else, but you killed a lamb and sacrificed it and had a barbecue in my name. So, we're okay. You're fooling yourself. You think this is light, but it's darkness. It says, I will not look upon them. It says, take away from me the noise of your songs. To the melody of your harps, I will not listen. Gosh, these like professional musicians who probably the band was great and they're cranking it up and they're singing their praise songs. And God says, but if your heart's not for me, get that noise away from me. Do you see the thing that's broken here is not the style of worship, the style of religious practice. The thing that's broken is the intimate relationship between God and his people. The people have walked away from God. Verse 24 says, "But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." You want to do something that honors God? Live justly. We'll get to Micah soon. In fact, maybe Micah's next. I can't remember. But in Micah, we'll be reminded to live justly and love mercy and walk humbly with God. But here, Amos tells the people, look, you want to honor God, knock off all this fancy religious practice stuff, and instead begin with living a life of justice. Isn't it interesting that God focuses in on how they treat each other? In the same way that probably when you were a kid punching your brother and sister in the backseat of the car, a parent turned around and said, "You don't love me if you don't love your brother." And that is true. If we look around and treat people badly, this has everything to do with the way our culture is set up. And look, I'm a pastor. I don't have a lot to say about the culture outside the church. I'm talking about us as the church. If we behave in such a way where people are oppressed, if we spend our time, money, energy in a way that's lowering other humans instead of drawing them to God and investing in them and connecting with them and connecting with God, man, it's like God saying, why all the religion if you don't care about people? This word justice has gotten really co-opted by just the culture, the news, whatever, to where some points, I've heard great arguments of, Christians going, I would never use the word social justice, and others saying like, oh, being a Christian is all about social justice. Can you forget about whatever the world means by social justice and just say this? God is just. You and I, if we are going to honor God, have to live justly in a way that does service to our neighbor. It's interesting to me that in the middle of the 1900s, the civil rights movement, the people that were on the right end of that latched on to this passage and said, that's what we're doing, is we're saying color shouldn't matter as it pertains to personhood, as it pertains to voting, as it pertains to where we live and eat and, what bathroom we go to, whatever. They said, look, this is an issue of justice. And you and I live in a time where it's still very meaningful for us to say, look, do you want to honor God? It doesn't start with, it ends with religious practice, but it starts with a heart that says, God, I just want to love you and I want to live justly in this place with the people around me. I don't want to oppress anybody. I want to treat people great. Now, again, don't wrestle with me. Wrestle with Amos. He's the one who said it. Wrestle with God. He's the one that inspired Amos to say it. But the challenge for us is to say, not just how do we have the perfect style of worship and wear the perfect things to church and have the perfect looking sanctuary and have the perfect religious practices, but to say, no, it starts with, do we really have a heart for God and a love for our fellow man? Have a great day.